PK when I left the service in 1986 after a couple of heart attacks, and I joined the job in July of 1946.
How many years did you do?
I'd done 40 then, 40 years exactly. I should have done 43 to get my pension, but as I say, I retired 3 years before that due to, health.
Where did you train?
My initial training was done, like most of my generation, at Blackwall. Just trying to think of what his name was. Cooper, Mr. Cooper was the instructor of lightkeepers in those days. He used to be a mechanic with the service. I suppose one should now say engineer, but we always called them mechanics. And he took this job as instructor of lightkeepers, and he also had another job, and that was to test all the fuel and the buoy chains. Anything that was imported into Blackwall for the lightships or the lighthouses, he would have to make sure it conformed to our specifications. That was his other job, but he was known as the instructor of lightkeepers. And I think I was there in the summer of 1946. The war hadn't been over very long. When you walked down Leamouth Road there, it was an absolute bomb site. The buildings had been cleared away, and just at the top of Leamouth Road, I always remember there was an entrance, and that's all there was, an entrance, entered onto a bomb site, and it had the medical, the snakes around the staff, which was the medical, and apparently that's where all the immigrants used to have to go to get their medicals before they emigrated around the world to Australia and places like that, because it was all cleared away during the war. I don't quite know what's down Leamouth Road now. The last time I was down there in the early 80s, it was still pretty well a bomb site. They hadn't done very much. But as I say, I'd done about my first initial training there, which was your Molson semaphore. I was only 17 when I joined the job. At that time, I think I was the youngest man who'd ever been in the service. I think with myself, I was 17, and there was another man called Gwilym, a little Welsh fella, and he was 17, and he left after about 2 years. And after that, they upped the age, because people were being demobbed from the services, so they could get plenty of candidates to come in the service. So the age group did go up, and after my initial application, of course, I applied when I was far too young. I must have applied to come in the job when I was about 16. And I remember it was people like Jack Burridge, who came in the job about the same time as myself. Of course, they'd just been demobbed out of the services. And the one you just mentioned from Cromer, whose name escaped me very quickly. Graham Fern, that's right. Graham Fern was there as well. Jack Burridge. Well, that's they'd just been demobbed. Graham had just come out of the Navy. Jack had been in the Army. So they were that much older than I. So I was very much the baby. And I remember leaving Blackwall to go to my first station, which was St Anne's Head in Pembrokeshire, and it was the longest train journey I'd ever taken in my life, and what to me as a young typical, I won't say a typical Londoner, I suppose, but never really been terribly far, as one couldn't during the war, to a place called Haverfordwest, which I found in those days quite a tongue twister. And from Haverfordwest I had to get a taxi out to St Anne's Head, which was quite a way. And the first person I met there was a man called Pine, Leslie Pine, who also joined the job a couple of months before me, and he'd also been demobbed from the army, but he was a lot older. He was a prisoner of war with the Japanese, I rather fancy he was on the Burma-Siam Railway towards the end of it. I know he'd had a rough time, and that's why Trinity were very good with him, because he wasn't much of a keeper. He had a to put it charitably to say, had a learning difficulty. In actual fact, he came from Whitby here. His father was AK at Whitby here in the 30s, and Leslie, before the war, had started to serve his time as a mechanic with Harrison's Garage, who was still going in Whitby, and he still remembered, funnily enough, by one or two of the older people that are probably coming on for their 70s now, and said, "Oh, I remember serving my time with a man called Pine." Anyway, Leslie was the first one I met, and I relieved him. He was putting the light in, because at the time I got there, it was just about sunset, and he said, "Well, you better come up and see how you put the light in." That's the first time I've been in a lighthouse, the first time I've seen a lighthouse optic. We'd done the training at Blackwall with the hood burners as they were then. The main source of light in those days was a paraffin light, which you probably heard about. And it was an old occulting light. You wound up a little clock, and a big hood used to drop down over the light. And I think it was about 4 seconds in every 30, so 2 seconds in every 30 this St Anne's light was. I can't remember what the character was. But there used to be two destroyers that used to come in and out, because it was a big Royal Naval Air Station, HMS Goldcrest, the other side of Dale, which was, as I say, was within a year of the ending of the war. And while there was flying going on, there was always two destroyers out at sea, in case anything went wrong. HMS Vidal, I think, was one of them. But the great thing at St Anne's was that the Coast Guard station was literally next door to the lighthouse. Now I believe it's moved into the old light at St Anne's Head, but it was just a little wooden hut within, say, 10 yards of the lighthouse door. And the Coast Guards then were also young men that just come out of the Navy, wartime service. And the Coast Guards in those days were taking yeomen of signals in. They really wanted yeomen, because there was an awful lot of more signalling going on those days, and St Anne's was a station where you reported ships to Lloyd's, and most ships that went past, the Coast Guards used to call them up. What ship do you want reporting? And if they did want reporting to Lloyd's, I think they got £0.50 a time for it, which was quite good money in those days. After I left St Anne's, I was there when a man called Harry Warder retired. Warders were quite a well-known Trinity family. I think he was about the second or third generation in it. He had a brother called Frank, who was at the Spurn here. But Harry Warder had joined the job, I suppose, around about 1899, 1900, and he'd just done 40 or 43 years. No, but about 1903 he would have joined. And his great ambition was to do what his great-grandfather had done. He'd done 40 years in the service and 43 years on pension. He was 103 when he died. And I remember Frank's last words were to me. He said, "Well, if I get my prophecy, lad, you'll be just about ready for tiring as I'm ready to go to the as I'm ready to be buried." He didn't, in actual fact, but I think he did get into his 80s, so he had about 20 years in retirement. After that, I came home on a week's leave, and in those days, the average supernumerary keeper in those days was away from home for about a year. And it wasn't this case of going out for a couple of months, or going to a land station and then going home for a spell and then going back again. You more or less travel from one place to another. I certainly was away for about a year before I came home, but I left St Anne's and went straight to Swansea Depot, where I was told I had to go on to Lundy South for the relief. And I'd had no idea of what to get in the way of food. As you know, we had to take a month's food out at a time for Lundy South. and the ship was the Triton. Anyway, they told me the greengrocer where the keepers went and got their food, and I remember getting what I suppose would have been a couple of weeks at the most, because I remember when the ship was going through the lock at the time, they said to me, well, you know, get the taxi driver to bring you to so-and-so lock, because we've got to get out while the tide is right. We'll wait for you at the lock. And I caught up with them at the lock, and when they said, is that all the food you've got, I knew that perhaps I hadn't got enough. But I mean, I had no idea, nobody had told me. In those days, I always thought about this a long while afterwards, that nobody at Blackwall told me what you should really be even thinking of taking out. And we always made sure with supers after that you gave them one of your shopping lists, and they could at least add or subtract to it. There are things that perhaps you like. I mean, a lot of people like those tins of stewed steak or something like that, which I never bothered with, but I mean, you would... it gave you some idea of the sort of quantities that you would have to take out. Anyway, eventually we landed up at Lundy South after one of those interminable journeys down the Bristol Channel doing lightship reliefs, back in and filling. And I remember the boat couldn't get onto the beach for some reason rather, and at that time Lundy South had a hoist. It was a big cable from the top of the cliff, actually in the lighthouse yard, with a box to it, which was low. You could lower down to sea level, and they said, "Oh, you can go up in the box." And I remember one of the crew saying, "You don't have to do that, son. It's bloody dangerous." But I didn't see any harm in it. So lo and behold, I get into this box, and I suppose in retrospect it was probably put there when they built the place, because it was the only way of getting materials virtually from sea level up to the lighthouse, because the other path up was absolutely torturous, and apart from very, very hard work. So I dare say that gear was pretty ancient. And there was a little steam engine, a little donkey steam engine that used to had to be stoked up on the morning of relief about 6 or 7 hours before, so you had to make sure you had enough steam to bring all the gear up. And that's what the keepers used to use it for, was not so much to bring the personnel up, was you could land on the beach and walk up, but save carrying all your food up. And all the oil, I mean, in those days oil was landed in drums and water was landed in barrels. So that hoist did save you a long climb. I don't know how high Lundy South is above sea level. There's, must be about 150 foot. Anyway, I got up there, and there was a man called Charlie Waghorn was PK. And Ray somebody or other. His father had been the depot clerk at Harryhead. His name may come to me in a minute. They were very, very good. Charlie Waghorn was one of the old-time PKs who done as little as he possibly could if he could find a younger man to do it, and he did suffer from stomach trouble, and come the time when it was to come and wind up, he always had griping stomach pains until he said, "I'll go and wind up for you, skipper," because it was a very, very heavy wind there. As you know, the lenses were driven by a clockwork mechanism which had to be wound up every hour, and it was a long, long, heavy wind. So I don't blame him. When you're a 17-year-old, and he must have been coming on for his 60s, I guess, certainly into his 50s. That I suppose he felt, why should I go and graft when I've got a youngster here? It was an explosive fog signal, which I didn't like. I never did like bangs. I'm afraid after the war, living in London during the war, I had really a gut full of bangs and thumps and explosions. And I got to admit that I never did. I didn't mind doing it myself because you knew when the bang was going to come, but I never really ever got used to this quarter of a pound of tonite going off every 3 minutes, and it was quite a crack, and particularly if you were outside. And the more you were waiting for it, the more it made you jump when it happened. This was coming on the winter of 1946 now. I think I went off on Armistice Day 1946, which was November the 11th. Just before Christmas, I had to go and do duty at the North End, North Lundy. Now the ship tried to done the relief at the South End and then steamed around for the North End to do the North End relief, but by then the weather was getting pretty bad. They had the keepers and all the gear in the boat and they couldn't make the landing at the North End, so they went all the way around back onto the ship, unloaded the boat, the motorboat, and took the ship back down to the South End and landed all our gear, all our food at the South End. And this would be about a week, 10 days before Christmas maybe. And the keepers were told to walk across the island, which they duly done, carrying what they could for enough food for at least for a day. Lundy in those days was uninhabited apart from a man called Heasman, who was then the agent for the island. A man called Gade had been the agent before the war, and I think sometime afterwards he came back, I believe, Gader, but I never met him. This man Heasman was the agent for the island, and there was a Scottish farmer. No, he was a Devonian, his wife was Scottish, broad Aberdonian Scot, lovely woman. And they had a daughter who was at school somewhere around about Barnstaple. But there was a tractor of sorts, and the idea was to get all our food, or get the tractor to come down onto the beach at Lundy South. We would get our food down from the Lighthouse, and they would bring it across Lundy North to the top, where we would have to ferry it down. But that winter of 1946-47 was one of the severest winters I think we've had in the last 40 years. And a blizzard started blowing up, which went on for weeks. So we eventually had no food, and we were sounding for, well, not fog, but certainly poor visibility. The fog signal was going. And he got to the state and said, well, look, we're going to have to go across. The other keepers, bearing in mind there's only 3 of us, the other 2 keepers, both Welsh. There again, I can't remember their names. Emlyn Williams was one of them. The other one was Richardson, I think. Anyway, they decided that they were going to have to leave me on my own, which was pretty frightening for somebody with virtually no experience at all of machinery, and a dang great diesel engine thundering away there, which they showed me how to go and oil up every hour. And there was a radio beacon, which more or less took care of itself. But they got up in the morning and they dressed themselves up and took haversacks and bags, and they were going to carry enough food for us to last us for as much as they could carry, which they did, and they were gone all day, and they were absolutely exhausted by the time they come back, battling against this through very, very heavy snow. And when you think back on it, it was probably a very, very dangerous trip, because when you walked across Lundy, if I remember rightly, to the 1.5 3/4 wall, there was a well-defined path and stones, but with the depth of snow that was on the island, they could have very, very easily lost themselves. And literally walked over the cliff. It nearly happened to me once. And then, I think bit by bit over the month, we gradually got our food back. I remember we spent Christmas Day with this farmer. I think it must have been my day off, which we spent Christmas Day with this farmer and his wife in a very, very draughty house. Len Hart was one of the other keepers that had come up on Lundy South by then. Anyway, I was there for 4 months in all. I'd done 2 months at the South, 2 months at the North, straight off. never. I had to go from the Londys, 4 months on Lundy, and I came ashore around about the end of February. And there again, they couldn't make the landing, so we had to carry all our gear to Gannet's Combe and climb down the cliff where the boat could take us off on the lee side of the island. And I remember climbing down Gannet's Combe with all my gear in case, and it wasn't very, very easy. I wouldn't like to have to do it now, and we eventually got taken off. I was already ordered food by letter, presumably, and I had to go on to Flatholmes without even coming ashore, so that would have been 6 months. I would have been away by the time I got ashore, and I'd given up smoking, I remember. I used to smoke a pipe, and I deliberately hadn't ordered any tobacco. I thought, well, there's one way of breaking the habit is not having any. So I landed on Flatholmes in February 1947. That winter was just beginning to come to an end, and that was a pretty old eerie spot. Flatholmes during the war had been garrisoned by the army, and then there was a big prisoner of war cage at Bridgend where a lot of German troops were still there. And I mean, this was over a year after the end of the war, and we still had prisoners of war. I don't know why we were so slow in repatriating them in retrospect, but there were some pretty tough old fellas up on Flatholmes. I think they used to use Flatholmes as a place where they put the naughty boys, same as they did the Caskets during the war. It was almost a detention camp, and anybody that caused trouble, they used to ship them out on this island for a while. But it was good for us because we used to get a boat every other day from Barry, run by the RAC, the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, I think. They used to run these boats. So if you wanted anything, they were very, very good to us. And I always remember the Germans were very, very good. They always helped to carry your gear across the island, because there again there was quite a long walk from the landing across the island, carrying gear or pulling gear in a trolley or a barrow. I can't remember what it was, but I remember they were going to do some welding, and there was a big oxygen cylinder, and they're pretty heavy oxygen cylinders. I remember one of these Germans picked this oxygen cylinder up, slung it over his cock shoulder, and he walked right across the island to the lighthouse and never even put it down once or changed his shoulder. So I thought, well, made a mental note. There's one fellow we're not going to cross. But they were pretty good. Not many of them could speak English, but one or two of them. The cook was very good because he used to break bread every day, and they would do anything for a smoke. They used to make some beautiful inlaid wood work boxes and trays, poker work trays. I remember just for fags. My sister still got those, I believe, that I bought there and then. But the most eerie thing I can remember, always think about when I think about Flatholmes, is that first night was the night that the Tampan was sunk, which was a tanker that went on ashore at, I think it may have been Porthcawl. It was certainly somewhere not too far away along that stretch of the Welsh coast. And it was the night of the Mumbles lifeboat disaster. It was one of those things where a ship came ashore and the crew, unfortunately, panicked to get off. They've got to get off the ship, and the lifeboat came alongside to get the crew off, touched bottom, and capsized. And the whole of the lifeboat crew were lost. And 3 or 4 hours later, the crew of this damn ship, they come down a rope ladder and with their suitcases and they walk ashore along the rocks. It was high and dry. There's this panic to get off. And I always remember that night. And the reason I remember it was because normally on Flatholmes there was a donkey to carry all the gear, but you could never get hold of this donkey because it used to go and stand in the middle of the pond, as it did on Lundy. You could never. They got cute. 27 days you could do what you like with it. On the 28th, when he knew you had to work, it didn't want to know at all. And I knew there had been a donkey, but I mean, I'm talking about within 4 or 5 hours of landing. I had to keep the 8 to 12. I said, well, you take the first watch and call me at midnight. And that's the way they done it. And they took me up and showed me what to do and how to wind up. The usual thing you get when you're new on a station. And I remember coming across the island to wind up for the midnight, and it was pitch black, and this gale was blowing, and all the old Nissen huts, which the army had were still there, and bits of corrugated iron were flapping, and doors were banging. It really was spooky. And you had this feeling that there was something behind you. You knew you were being followed. Of course, you automatically think of these Germans, and I remember in the end, it was blind panic, and you literally run across the island just out of sheer fear, because I don't think I even had a torch. I was just going by where the light was. And I remember winding up and plucking up enough courage to come down the stairs, and there was no light in the tower. Everything was oil. Just groped my way up, because we used to keep a little paraffin lamp at the base of the stairs you used to carry up with you or leave it. There was just enough light to grope your way up the stairs to wind up. And I remember coming back down, plucking up enough courage to walk back across the island to the quarters, which is a matter of, what, 200, 250 yards, something like that. It was not terribly far, but bad enough on a bad night. And there again, you've had this feeling there was something behind you, and I put my hand out just to reassure myself that there was nothing there, and you touched something soft and warm, and by God, I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life before or since. And I felt I was being chased by all the bats in hell. I remember leaping the wall there and going into this fellow's bedroom, waking up and saying, for God's sake, there's something out there. He was after me. He said, oh God, man, it's the donkey. It wants its sugar. They hadn't told me that when you go and wind up, this donkey used to follow you across the island and back again, and used to give it a bit of sugar. So it was behind me. It was that black I couldn't see it. And when I put my hand down, I obviously touched the thing. But that's the biggest fright I've ever had in my life. If it was happened to me now, I think I would drop dead. Anyway, after 2 months, I came ashore from there, and I went home for about a week, I think. I had a fortnight's leave, that's right. It always rankled me, because I had a fortnight's leave. And then I remember Cow's Depot ringing up and saying, oh, you've been appointed to the Caskets in the Channel Islands. You better go over there. I said, well, it isn't, the relief isn't. Oh, he said, but you've got to live over there, because in those days you had to go and live where the lighthouse was. I said, I can't live in the Channel Islands. Oh, well, you know, if you don't live over there, you know, have to pay all your own fares, etc., which, you know, from London where I was living, or in Essex in those days, to the Channel Islands, it was all of £5 of fare. So I remember it was about £5, 6 shillings or something on the ship, plus your rail fare down to Weymouth or Southampton. So it wasn't very, from our point of view, it wasn't very satisfactory. Anyhow, again, you were duty bound to go, and I went over to Guernsey, so from Southampton, and then from Guernsey to Alderney, and that's one of the roughest crossings I think I've ever been on. That stretch of water between Guernsey and Alderney, for someone who's not a particularly good sailor, was, to say the least of it, trying. And I met Nick Allen, who was then the boatman for Caskets. And I spent a very happy week off over there, waiting to go off and getting to know people. And it was marvellous. The island was barely coming back from being occupied during the war, and Alderney was one of the few Channel Islands where everybody had been taken off. It was rather sinister, because there had been a lot of slave labour over there, and I'm afraid with some of the excesses that had been committed against them, they more or less had a free run of the island, the Germans. So some of the locals were just beginning to drift back, and it was marvellous, because if you wanted anything in the shop and they were having their dinner, they said, well, go and help yourself and leave the money on the till. Nothing was ever locked up, and it was probably the way that life used to be in this country, probably at the turn of the century. You went back 100 years. It was very, very drab and run down. Nothing had been painted for the war years, and I can always remember those cobbled streets in St Anne's, the village. It was very, very run down and very, very sparse, but a tremendous atmosphere of optimism. Anyway, I went over to the Caskets. Harry Hall was the PK, Harold Hall. Daddy Hall, as he became known later, because his wife always used to call him Daddy. Leslie Blondin, who was a local man, was the other AK. Norman from Sark. Norman Wackley, who was the same age as me. He was the other SAK that used to come relieving. He joined the Channel Island Lighthouse service, as 2 or 3 of them did. And Norman was the one that lasted longest. He hasn't retired a little bit after me, I rather fancy. And I'd done 18 months on the Caskets, which was very interesting because that had been run by the Germans during the war and had been mined, so there were parts of the island the rock where they didn't want you to go. There had been 2 commando raids off on the Caskets during the war. It had been used as a detention camp, as I said. And I think it was a man called Bonnie Newton and a Major Appleyard, I think, of the Royal Marines. They prior to Dieppe, they used to go over to the Channel Islands purely to some sort of training exercise. Presumably, they used to do bizarre things like go and leave the day's copy of the Sunday Times in the German commandant's letterbox. Ridiculous things like that, but I suppose it was a good exercise. Anyhow, they decided one time they would raid the Caskets, as they'd done several times. So they took the whole damn lot of them off, took them all prisoners and brought them back to England. And after that, the Germans they sort of fortified the place. They knocked the wall down at the top. They put a damn great Spandau machine gun. And if you look at the landing post on the Caskets, if it's still there, it was absolutely riddled with bullet holes where they used to use it as presumably for target practice. And there was a pom-pom on the engine room roof, which we tipped over and laid there for years afterwards. And a big graph on the wall outside the kitchen, or the living quarters. We had 1 aeroplane, so I presume they must have shot an aeroplane down, and hundreds of seagulls. Significance perhaps I'm not go into, but the thing I got a photograph of somewhere was a big German naval ensign with Sieg Heil painted on the engine room walls. I've got a photograph of that somewhere. And all the Germans also they always used to write their names in paint on the rocks, and the whole of the island would daub with Germans' names, and presumably, although I can't read German, I was told it was places things like "never again" and "this is the end of the world." They obviously weren't very impressed with the Caskets, although from a lighthouse keeper's point of view, it was one of the best rocks I think I've ever been on, because it was big and it was interesting, and you had your own room and it had a bathroom, I remember, which is almost unheard of on the. It actually took the war for the Germans to put a bathroom onto a British lighthouse, which was up to pre-war, of course, had never been heard. In fact, even when we were first married, over the first couple of stations, we had never had a bathroom. It was a case of the tin bath in front of the fire. But I get ahead of myself. Anyway, I left the Caskets after 2 years, because coming in the service so young, I was hitting 19, and national service was still going on, and I was supposed to do my national service, and I was deferred for a couple of years, and eventually the services said, well, look, there's only 2 of you in Trinity House of military age, you might as well let them go. So Trinity said, okay, well, goodbye. And they said, well, we're not going to make your money up like they used to during the war, I remember. But they said your seniority would carry on and your job would be waiting for when you come out. So I went and done 2 years in the RAF, and that was delayed until I'd done about 2.5 years because of the Suez crisis. And when I came out of the RAF, I went to the Sperm because there wasn't a station for me. I was travelling around doing SAK's duties again. I remember going to the Spurn and then Trevose Head and 1 or 2 other stations purely just to do standby duty and work my way into it again. And then I was appointed to Portland Breakwater, which was the entrance to the Royal Naval Harbour at Portland. There used to be 3 breakwaters. There was Holyhead Breakwater, Plymouth Breakwater, Portland Breakwater, and originally Dover Piers. Dover Piers had gone a long while before I joined the job, but the other 3 breakwaters were going, and of course they were considered very, very cushy little numbers, as indeed they were. But there was one big disadvantage from the keeper's point of view: they were all two-handed. So you worked about 64 hours a week watchkeeping. I was there with a man called Tucker, Leslie Tucker, who lost an eye in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. A notorious keeper. He never got on with anybody, on principle. An extremely difficult man to get on with, but in some respects you learned a lot from him. He was a great carpenter. So if you took an interest in carpentry, it was a bit more forgiving. But first thing in the morning when he got up, it was a case of look out. He would rattle the coal bucket to see that it was filled. He was one of those men that got up of a morning and determined to find something wrong, which of course he did. And then when Tucker, after I'd been there for about a year, I think he left. And then Leslie Pine, who I mentioned first of all from St Anne's, his father came there, called Silas Pine. And Silas Pine had been at the South Foreland through the whole of the war and got a BM for it. He was right in Hellfire Corner, right in the very, very restricted zone, I remember, as it would have been during the war. And I had a happy year with him. A nice old boy, lovely old fella, very religious man, very easy. And then Tucker had to come back when Silas Pine retired, and I'm talking about 1953. And then I heard that I'd been appointed to the Wolf. And from Portland Breakwater to the Wolf Rock was a cultural shock, I suppose one would call it now. And by this time I was also courting my wife on my months ashore. So I duly presented myself to the Penzance depot, full of fear and trepidation after having on the whole done reasonably well on my rock stations to find lighthouse keeping in the Raw. Now presumably you've interviewed people from the Wolf. It was a funny place. It was fascinating, and I'm glad I went there when I was the age I was, because I was there with a couple of PKs who were probably in their 50s, and it could not have been easy. It could not have been easy. It was all sheer hard graft on reliefs of winding very, very heavy gear up into the tower and humping and carrying. In those days, of course, there was no refrigerators off there. And come to think of it, there wasn't even a toilet. There was an Elson bucket in the lantern for a toilet. And believe me, when you had to go and empty that in a force 9 gale from the southwest, when there's nothing between you and America, you made damn sure that you got to leeward. Or you literally got your own back. But I look back with considerable experience, considerable nostalgia on those days. I spent 2 years there because everything was worn out. There was a little original Ackroyd diesel engine on there for the fog signal. It used to pump at £5 per square inch for a little reed fog signal. Now this engine must have been made about 1902, so it was 50 years old. You literally heated the head up with a blow lamp, and then you switched the fuel on, and you literally got on your hands and knees with a lump of cut waste, and you pulled the flywheel around until it started to fire. And it would just sound like a bag of bolts. How it ever went beyond was beyond me, because there was no spares for it, and literally the bore, actually you could see it was almost oval when they took the piston out of it. So they used to put out, have rings made or get more and more and more oversized just to keep some sort of compression. But go it did, and I remember writing to I think it was Stuart Turner's had taken over the firm that had built it, who were Hornsby. And they had no record of this engine at all. It went before their records. It was probably an experimental engine, and they were absolutely amazed. And I believe they took that engine out when they did replace it, and threw it in the sea, rather than bringing it ashore, because it would be worth a bomb now if anybody had the common sense to have saved it. But it was little things like that. The lens had been shot up during the war. The Germans had machine gunned the lantern, and so the lens were all broken and smashed up, so consequently the whole optic was out of balance, and they put screwed great lead weights, and it was a roller driven lens. It wasn't one of those that was floating on mercury, so the whole of the optic was very, very erratic, to say the least of it, and to keep that light turning over night time was a bit of a work of art. You could not use lubricating oil on the rollers or the guys. It would pull it up. The only thing that we could take would be castor oil, believe it or not. We used to have a gallon. We used to have a can of castor oil come off a month. That was the only thing that the lens would operate on, was castor oil, and you had to go around and oil the tracks on these rollers to try and keep this damn optic going. It was a red and white light before the war, but it was they blanked out all the red panels because half of them had been smashed, and it was an all-white light when I was here. I believe it's gone back to red and white again now. I was married from the Wolf. I was almost late for my wedding. I remember when I came ashore prior to the leave before I was married, we went and saw the vicar in the London parish of Islington, who couldn't get much further away from the sea, and said we wanted to be married on the 11th of September. But we might have to get married the week before or the week after, or a fortnight before or a fortnight after, and then we had to explain why, and he thought it was absolutely hilarious. But he entered into the spirit of it, and eventually I did get ashore with a couple of days to spare, I remember. And Trinity, in their benevolence, decided it was about time I left the Wolf, and my first land station was Start Point, a little bit further up the road, as it were. So we went to Start Point. I think it must have been around about February 1955. Straight from London. I remember Vi going up, making up our bed that night, and says, "I can't find the electric light switch." And I was quite astounded to be told there wasn't one. It was still Tilly lamps in those days. There was no electricity. So it was a cultural shock for her. Straight out of the metropolis to the wilds of Devon. And we spent 4 very happy years there. Reg Guppy was the PK that we really did like there, first couple of years there. who made our life a lot easier. But we were there and there was no transport. We had no transport. I remember trying to buy an old banger for about £5 and couldn't raise it. But eventually I got one of the first Lambretta scooters in South Devon, which did make life a lot easier when you can go off the station. There was only a bus once a week, and you were 10 miles from Kingsbridge, and there was a walk because it was about halfway. Kelton was halfway between Start Point and Kingsbridge, so consequently we didn't leave the station an awful lot. And from there we went to the North Foreland. We followed a PK who I was with at the time, called Woodruff. He'd gone to North Foreland, and I got on very well with him. And when the then AK had been made up to PK, he asked could I go there, and they did. They sent me there. It was a bit of a mixed blessing because they rebuilt Start Point while we were there. They put the new houses up, which are still there now. So we had all the dirt and the dust, and a long story about rebuilding, how not to build a house. So it was with mixed blessings that we went to the North Foreland. But North Foreland was a lot easier station. It was in walking distance of Broadstairs. There was no fog signal there, but unfortunately again you were coming back to a two-handed station and all that watch keeping. There were very, very long hours, and eventually while we were there I think they started this business of having an outsider and an occasional keeper to come in and give you some relief, so you both got one day off a week. Previous to that, of course, you didn't. You just worked right through and you got your fortnight's annual holiday or whatever it was. I don't think it was much more than a fortnight in those days. And so we were there for about 2 or 3 years. And from then I was made... No, I didn't. I went from there to the Hanwha, back over to the Channel Islands again. Now I did enjoy the Hanwha. We lived in the Torterville cottages at the Hanwha, which were probably some of the most picturesque quarters that we had in the service, overlooking that lovely little Portlet Harbour. Dick Jeffers was the PK when I was there, we got on very well with. I by this time had a young daughter. And then I was made PK, and we had to leave the Channel Islands on an August bank holiday Monday to go to Holyhead. All our furniture was packed up. We didn't know when it was going to get there. Even if we did know when it was going to get there, we didn't have a home to put it into. And I remember I was absolutely desperate. It's hard to think now in this day and age that Trinity were that insensitive. They just moved you from one place to another, irrespective of whether there was quarters or not. You will find somewhere was the attitude. You will find somewhere up in Holyhead. And it was only people like Edgar Lewis and the then superintendent, who was Bernard Burnett or something like that, or rather fancy, who were very, very good. No, it wasn't. It was Captain Merrick. They were very, very good, and they did try. I remember trying to buy a place even, but was told by a very supercilious estate agent that I didn't earn enough to finance that sort of mortgage. And that was for some of the cheapest houses in Holyhead, and believe me, some of them were pretty cheap up there in those days. Anyway, we eventually got a little rented place out at Trada Bay, which proved to be far too expensive. It really was a holiday let. They wanted you in for the winter and out in the summer. And we eventually got another one at RAF Valley, or just outside RAF Valley. One of the recent conversions from probably what have been cow buyers. which rather upset my wife because it was absolutely crawling with rats. And I came ashore from the Smalls to find my wife almost a nervous wreck, and quite rightly too. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. Here am I, this is promotion. I've got nowhere to live. I'm supposed to provide a home and a wife, supposed to provide an income and a home for my family, and I'm really doing neither. So I went and saw the superintendent and said, well, I think I'm going to have to pack this damn job in because it's, I'm just getting nowhere rapidly. He was very sympathetic, and after about a week he said, well, look, some bees, the keeper up there is having to retire on health grounds, would you go up there even if it's only for a while? So it was, at least it was a home. So I went back and said, well, we're going to go to some bees, because I really shouldn't have had a landlight. The ink was hardly dry on my PK's ticket, as it were. And we went to some bees and were there for 4 years. I don't particularly have unhappy memories of some bees, but it is such a godforsaken climate in that part of the world. A lot of people love the Lake District, and I should be the last person to knock it, but I have no regard at all for the Lake District. All I can remember is rain, 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 and still more rain. We were probably more conscious of it because it was one of those stations that used to do the Met. Every hour we used to do the Met, and every 3 hours the synoptics. So you were conscious, and I don't remember there were very, very few days in any year where that rain gauge was completely empty. Anyway, we made a lot of friends there, and it was a very, very interesting place because I got interested in nautical history over there, because West Cumberland was a place that had built an awful lot of ships and was a very, very busy ports, the West Cumberland ports. But it had all finished, but there was an awful lot of, hadn't been a great deal of population movement, so there was still a lot of records, and I remember doing a lot of nautical research onto Whitehaven ships, which when I left, was almost a trunkload of papers which I deposited in the Carlisle Records office. And I was very pleased to go back over there a couple of years ago to Maryport and find that my collection of photographs now is called the Sythes collection, and is on display in the museum over at Maryport, which I didn't even know until I saw my own name there. That was very gratifying to know at least there was some spin-off over it. Then they eventually caught up with me and said, now look, you didn't do an awful lot of rock time when you were made PK, it's about time that you did. And they said, well, you've got to go to the Longstone. I remember people saying over there, oh God, you're going to go to the Longstone and the North East Coast, oh, it's bitterly cold over there. As it probably is, but at least it had the one redeeming feature of being dry. We had done 2 years on the Longstone, which was very, very happy. Another one of those rock stations that are nice big rocks. And if you're interested in wildlife and birds, it was a great station. And by this time I was doing quite a lot of painting, taking up painting as a hobby soon after I'd been married. I was becoming reasonably successful at it, both as a painter and of course from a financial point of view. I was selling quite a lot. The only fly in the ointment was the then boatman, Willie Donaldson, who was perhaps another man that rather liked upsetting people with very, very little reason. But it wasn't only me, it was everybody you came in contact with. So he was something that you had to live with. And when you're content and happy on a station with everybody, there was this tendency in the service to move you. The only time they never seemed to move people was when everybody was at daggers drawn with one another. Then you would find that you would be with one another for years and years and years. But if you were on a contented station where everybody was getting on well, then they would decide to split you up. I was told that I had to come to Whitby. Len Hart, who I relieved here, was told he had to go to Lymouth Foreland. No, he didn't. He went to Bull Point. He petitioned not to go to Bull Point. I petitioned not to leave the Longstone. We probably would have done better if we'd have said, can we go on the next train? And they would have probably gone the opposite way. But either of us, we were both very, very curtly refused. And I had to come to Whitby, and poor old Len had to go to Bull Point. In retrospect, it was a very, very happy move because I spent brief 1972 until 1986 at Whitby. As lighthouses go from a scenic point of view, it isn't terribly great, but I was with a good crew. There was a local keeper had been taken on called Bill Dryden, who was an absolutely lovely man, and Phil Griffiths, who I also got on very, very well with. It was one of those stations where everybody sort of got on very well, and those happy, I look back on them, were considerably happy years. And I think that more or less brings me around just about up to date.